Hey, welcome to Q&A, where you ask your questions on faith and life, and I do my best to give a biblical perspective. Hey, we have a great question from Ben Lowe. I love God, but I've been wondering why God allows things like hunger and famine in specific parts of the world. You know, Ben, that's a great question, and I love that it's coming out of your love, your devotion to God, because what it's saying is that unlike so many people who make faith about themselves and what I can get out of it, you're looking at the world through the lens of faith, and it's begging questions. And I think that's really encouraging, really exciting for you. I wish I had a simple answer. There isn't, but let me just offer some reflections if I can. This has been my experience when I look out at the world and these types of questions arise as I see things that seem to be inconsistent with the character or the who God is and what he's capable of. And what I've found best is to step back and to ask two questions. The first is simply this: who or what is causing this situation? The second is, and what does the Bible have to say about that? And the reason I ask these questions is it helps me gain a perspective from the particular to the bigger picture, and it, as a consequence, allows me to have a bit more clarity, a bit more understanding, so that I can live my faith with greater purpose. So what happens when we apply those two questions to the context of hunger and famine? Well, who or what causes famine? Is it God, or is it climate change? You know, what's at the heart of famine? Now, whilst I'd be the first to say that, you know, particular crop failures in certain areas, particularly in Africa and in the subcontinent, give rise to localized famines, I'd want to say that famine as a whole is not the result of a crop failure. And the reason I say that is because experts and statistics tell us that annually the world produces more than enough food to feed everybody. So even though a particular crop may fail, there is more than enough food that is produced to be able to compensate for that, so that people need not be starving as a result of that. So for me, the issue isn't really a shortage of food, a crop failure, a famine. It's for whatever reason, whether it be political, whether it be economic, whether it be greed, apathy, whatever, those who are capable of addressing the need, those who are responsible for managing supply and distribution, are, for whatever reasons, choosing not to manage it on behalf of others, to not think outside themselves. Which leads to the second question: so what does the Bible say about that? Well, if you look at the Bible, first in this context, in this issue, the Bible tells us that we are called to be stewards of the earth resources. We're called to manage everything on behalf of God for the benefit of everybody. So why isn't that happening? Well, the Bible tells us about the fall. In the beginning, God created us in Eden. It was perfection. We had unbroken fellowship with God, but we had a choice to love God or not. And humanity chose to reject God's invitation for intimacy with him, and we chose to go it along. We rebelled and we pushed back. And as a consequence, sin entered the world, the Bible says. And that manifests itself in many ways. Some of the ways it manifests itself is selfishness, greed, a disregard for the welfare of others. And Romans 6:23 tells us that the wages of sin is death. Now, in this particular context, we see that people are dying physically from starvation because of the sin of others, of greed, of selfishness, of apathy, of an unwillingness to use what they have on behalf of others. So, you know, people could ease the suffering of others simply by sending food. They're choosing not to. That's a result of pride, whatever is behind it. It's a result of sin. Likewise, Romans 8:22 tells us that the whole of creation groans under the consequences of sin. So whether the crop failures is as a result of climate change or whatever, the fact that we're not stewarding the resources of the earth, we're using them for our own ends without regards to the consequences of those and how it might affect others, again, is a symptom of sin. So it's not that God allows it. We've brought some of this upon ourselves, and yet sadly we have the means to be able to redress it as well. Alongside of this, the Bible also tells us something of how God sees what's happening. Think of Matthew 25 and the parable about the sheep and the goats, where Jesus talks about the difference between the two. They all look the same, but it's their actions that determine the difference. And he says, verse 35, as he's drawing it to a close, he'll say to those on his right, he separates sheep and the goats, one to left, one to the right. And he says, "Come, you who are blessed by my Father, inherit the kingdom prepared for you from the creation of the world. Why? For I was hungry and you fed me. I was thirsty and you gave me a drink." And he goes on about visiting and caring for those in need. And then it goes on and says, "The righteous will reply, Lord, when did we see you hungry and feed you, or thirsty and give you something to drink?" And Jesus says, "I tell you the truth, when you did it to one of the least of these, my brothers and sisters, you're doing it for me." And he goes on and talks about the goats who have been separated to the left. And he says the same thing to them. And they answer, when did we see you hungry and thirsty that we could have given you food and drink? And he says, "I tell you the truth, when you refuse to help the least of these, my brothers and sisters, you are refusing to help me." So to answer your question, why does God allow hunger and famine in specific parts of the world? It's not that God allows it, but that God has given us free choice. We chose to rebel against God, and the outworking of that rebellion is a breaking down of society. We're seeing creation groaning, and it's not producing as it could, as it should. We're seeing people hoarding food instead of helping to meet the needs of others. And as a consequence of that, people are starving. Does God care? Absolutely. And that's why he's tasked the church with the Great Commission to go into all of the world, to share what we have with those who don't. The good news of the kingdom of heaven and its reality now, bringing to bear that the kingdom promises of abundance, of praying in the midst of famine for God to do a miracle, as Jesus did so many and brought about what was needed, that we could stand in the gap and pray for miraculous supply. Crops that had failed suddenly burst to life. Seeds that were dead suddenly come to life and give off their crops, and on it goes. What I'm saying is that God hasn't caused the famine. It's the result of human sin, of the fall. God's concern for its outworking in the church is part of the solution. And because you began your question with "I love God," and I just want to encourage you, because of your devotion and your faith, let that inspire you to pray, "God, how can I be part of the solution? How can I use what I have to help bring about hope and make a difference wherever I find myself?" Really great question. I hope that helps you make sense of it and gives you perhaps a couple of tools to use as you look out at the world and you have questions. Well, as always, you can ask your questions on slido.com. Use the hashtag ALC23. But that's it for now. Until next time, God bless.